On the morning of June 18th, 1865, somewhere in the cotton country behind Galveston, a man bent over a row he did not own, tending a crop he would never keep under the authority of a man who, by the law of the United States, had not owned him for nearly 900 days. He did not know this. No one had told him. The work was the same as it had been the morning before, and the morning before that. The order that freed him had been signed 2.5 years earlier, and in a city he had never seen, by a president he would never meet. And in all that time, not one line of it had reached the field where he worked. Think about what 900 days means. It is more than 2 years of mornings exactly like this one, 2 years of a man being legally free and practically enslaved, with no one in his world acknowledging the difference. So the question is not why freedom came to Texas late. A letter could cross the country in days. News of a battle reached the papers in a week. The question is why a man could be free on paper for 900 days and still be bent in that row on the morning of the 18th. And the answer is not distance, and it is not a slow horse. Almost every piece of that story is wrong, and the myth comes in three parts. First, it says the news was simply slow, that Texas was a distant frontier and freedom took 2.5 years to ride out to it on a tired horse. Second, it says a benevolent general arrived and handed freedom down like a gift from a generous hand. Third, it says that on that single day, slavery in Texas ended, clean, complete, and finished. The record says something more precise on all three counts. The delay was not an accident of geography, it was asset management, a deliberate protection of valuable property for as long as the war allowed. Freedom was not handed down by a kind man. It was enforced on the ground, backed by the army, and carried into the streets by black men in uniform. And nothing ended clean. The very order that declared people free stapled conditions to that freedom in the same breath, binding them back to the land they had just been freed from. This is the difference between the version that flatters everyone, North and South, soldier and citizen, and the version that actually happened. For the rest of the video, we are going to walk through the version that happened. And it begins with understanding exactly what was being protected and why it was worth protecting at almost any cost. The delay makes sense the moment you see what the country was holding on to. By 1860, the nearly 4 million enslaved people in the United States were valued as cold financial property at something on the order of $3.5 billion. To grasp that figure, set it beside everything else the country had built. Those 4 million human beings were worth more than every factory in the nation, more than every mile of railroad, and more than every bank combined. They were the single largest financial asset in the entire American economy. Sit with that because it dissolves the comfortable idea that slavery was a backward institution the country was slowly, regretfully outgrowing. Slavery was not beside the economy, off in some agrarian corner. It was the capital itself, the collateral a planter borrowed against, the inheritance a son expected to receive, the wealth a bank would lend money on. Human beings were mortgaged to build houses. They were insured against death and escape. They were bought and sold as financial instruments, traded the way we trade stocks today. A person in the ledger of this country was not only labor, a person was wealth, written down on a balance sheet. And once you see that, the delay was not confusion. And to see how that asset was built, you have to follow the cotton. But first, put that number on a scale and see what it actually weighed against everything else the nation had made. On that scale, the imbalance becomes the whole story. On one side, place 4 million human beings valued at $3.5 billion. On the other, pile everything else the nation had made, its factories, its locomotives, its rail lines, its banks, and their vaults, and the human side still drops lower. The people weighed more than the machines. That imbalance explains something the moral version of this story cannot. Ending slavery was never going to be a simple change of heart, a matter of the country waking up one morning and deciding to do better. To free these people was, in the cold arithmetic of the ledger, to take the single most valuable asset the nation owned and write it down to zero overnight. No economy in history surrenders its largest holding of capital without a fight. The ledger demanded war, and the war came. 4 years of it, and more than 600,000 dead. So before we go further, it is worth asking a simple question. Where did wealth on this scale actually come from? How did 4 million people become $3.5 billion? The answer is a single crop, and to understand it, you have to take the machine apart. That crop was cotton, and to see how it built the fortune, you have to look at how the machine actually ran. We tend to carry a comfortable picture of two separate worlds in the 19th century. On one side, the modern world, the mechanized textile mills of Britain and the American North, all smokestacks and steam and progress, the birthplace of the industrial age. On the other side, the backward world, the agrarian South, a region of plantations and fields, stuck in an older, cruder way of life, slavery, that the modern world was supposedly leaving behind. That picture is not just incomplete, it is actively misleading, and it does a quiet kind of work. It lets the modern industrial world imagine itself as separate from and morally above the brutality of the plantation. But they were not two worlds. The mill and the field were not strangers, divided by an ocean and a way of life. They were two halves of a single machine, one engine locked together, each turning the other, neither able to run without its partner. The smokestack and the cotton row were the same economy wearing two different faces. Now watch how that engine actually ran. Watch the parts turn stage by stage. It begins in the field where enslaved people did the picking, bent over the rows in the heat, dragging the long sacks under the threat of the lash that set the pace. By 1860, those fields had made the American South the source of roughly 2/3 of all the cotton grown on earth. From the field, the cotton moved to the port and across the Atlantic, and cotton alone made up about half of the entire country's export revenue, the single largest thing America sold to the world. Most of it sailed to the textile mills of Britain, and in those mills the cotton became thread and cloth and enormous profit, which created demand for still more cotton, which turned the fields again, which required still more enslaved hands, and the loop never closed because it was never meant to. The mill in Manchester and the field in Mississippi were not distant strangers. They were two ends of the same turning shaft, and the shaft never stopped. The wealth this machine threw off was almost difficult to imagine. On the eve of the war, the single richest county per person anywhere in the United States was Adams County, Mississippi, plantation country, cotton country. And every stage of that machine, from the first row picked to the last bolt of cloth woven, was fed by enslaved hands. So the loop closes and the picture is complete. The modern factories and the backward fields were never separate economies, never two different stages of human progress. They operated as a single, seamless, and staggeringly lucrative global machine, bound together by capital and fed from end to end by enslaved hands. This is the engine that made 4 million people worth $3.5 billion. And once you see it as one machine, a hard truth comes with it. The most modern economy on earth, the proud industrial world of the 19th century, was not separate from slavery. It ran on it. The cloth in a London shop and the chains in a Mississippi field were two ends of the same transaction. Now hold on to one more implication, because it drives everything that follows. No plantation owner watched the army approach and said, "Let it go," the way no one watches their life's wealth empty without a fight. The people who owned this machine did not watch the war approach and calmly let it stop. They did what the owners of any priceless asset would do when the thing protecting it begins to fail. They moved to save it. And that instinct to protect the asset, whatever it took, is exactly what carried tens of thousands of enslaved people across the country and into Texas. None of that wealth and none of that movement happened without forced migration of a kind the country has rarely counted honestly. It began decades before the war. Between 1820 and 1860, more than 1 million enslaved people were carried out of the worn out tobacco lands of the Upper South and driven into the cotton frontier of the Deep South, sold away from everyone they knew, marched in chained columns called coffles by the traders, the enslaved themselves named the soul drivers. This was the second Middle Passage. It broke families apart as a matter of routine business, and it is what physically built the Cotton Kingdom. And the far western edge of that frontier was Texas. So when the war finally came, Texas became the place the whole system fled to. As Union armies pushed down the Mississippi River and freedom advanced behind them, the enslaved ran toward those lines, toward the soldiers, toward liberty. But their owners did the cold arithmetic of the ledger and ran the other way, driving their human property west out of the army's reach on foot, in coffles, often at gunpoint. The practice even had a name. They called it refugeeing. And notice the direction it ran. Everyone else was moving toward freedom. This movement ran deliberately away from it, herding people deeper into bondage to keep the assets safe. And the place they ran to was no frontier. It was a vault. The scale of what was driven into Texas was enormous. The most reliable estimates of how many people were forced into the state this way run from 50,000 on the low end to as many as 150,000 on the high end. The numbers in the state tell the story plainly. Texas counted roughly 182,000 enslaved people in 1860. By the end of the war, that figure had swelled past 230,000. And that growth did not come from birth. It came from relocation, from people being marched in to keep them out of the Army's reach. So, set aside for good the picture of Texas as a sleepy frontier that the news of freedom was simply slow to reach. Texas was something far more deliberate. Texas was a vault, filled on purpose and sealed on purpose. It was the one corner of the Confederacy the war could not yet touch in force. And the system used it exactly as you would use a safe, a place to lock away your most valuable property, while the structure holding everything else began to collapse. So when General Granger's ships finally appeared in Galveston Bay in June of 1865, they were not delivering belated news to an isolated outpost. They were prying open one of the last great safes of human capital left standing on the continent. The delay was an asset, protected to the last possible morning. And here is something the single celebrated date can hide from us. There was never one moment when it all came true at once. It did not arrive everywhere on one bright morning by proclamation. It arrived the way the Army arrived, town by town, county by county, plantation by plantation, traveling at the speed of a column of blue uniforms coming up the row. The first watch was kept long before Texas on Freedom's Eve, the final night of 1862, as enslaved people gathered and waited for the Emancipation Proclamation to take legal effect at the stroke of midnight. From there, liberation spread unevenly for 2.5 years, always following the troops, never running ahead of them. In Columbus, Mississippi, freedom came on the 8th of May, 1865, when federal soldiers crossed in from Alabama. And that community has marked the 8th of May as its day ever since. Galveston's morning was June 19th. Some other counties was a different morning entirely. The truth is that the calendar of Black freedom celebrations across the South is really a map in disguise, a record of when and where the Army finally arrived. There was no single sunrise, and Galveston matters in this story not because it was the first place freedom dawned, but because it was very nearly the last. Now look closely at who actually carried that freedom in, because the legend has gotten it wrong. When the army did arrive, it did not look the way the legend paints it. The romantic version frames General Gordon Granger as a lone white hero stepping onto a balcony to hand freedom down to a grateful crowd. The reality is more complicated and far more powerful. Granger came into Galveston with roughly 2,000 troops, and a great many of the soldiers occupying Texas were black men, soldiers of the United States Colored Troops. Among the units sent to hold the state was the 29th Colored Infantry, a regiment raised in Illinois. Picture clearly who actually carried the end of slavery into those streets. It was not handed down by a benevolent stranger. It was brought in by black men in the uniform of the United States Army. Some of them born free in the North, some of them formerly enslaved themselves, bearing rifles and bearing orders backed by the full authority of the federal government. They fanned out through a city built on the buying and selling of people, and they were the ones who made freedom real on the ground. Trace that arc one more time, because what it reveals is the deepest irony in this entire story. Everything in this history had bent toward keeping these people as property. They were counted on a ledger as the nation's most valuable asset. They were driven west and locked into the Texas vault to keep that asset safe. For 2 centuries, the entire weight of the law, the economy, and the army had been arranged to hold them down as things that could be owned. And then the army came anyway, and the people the system had priced as property were the very ones who arrived to enforce its end. The asset enforced its own abolition. Hear that again. The most valuable property in America became the armed authority that freed it. The ledger that runs through this whole story, the cold accounting of human beings as dollars, was finally closed by the very hands it had spent generations counting. This is not a footnote, it is the whole story. The property had become the law, and once that had happened, slavery in Texas was not slowly fading. It was over, enforced at the point of a federal bayonet held by a black soldier. But what did that moment actually feel like for the 4 million people it reached? What did they make of a single word after a lifetime told they were property? The honest answer is that there was no single feeling. Freedom did not land the same way on any 2 people. For some, it was the pure, overwhelming thing, shouting, weeping, falling to their knees as the ground itself seemed to shift. For others, the moment was stolen quietly. The news simply withheld by an enslaver who wanted to squeeze one more harvest out of the crop already standing in the field, banking on the troops being 100 miles away. Some people did not wait to find out. They walked off that very hour to test whether the word was even real, or to begin the long search for a wife, a child, a mother who had been sold to another state years before. And some found there was nowhere to walk to at all. No land, no wage, no name on any deed. Just an empty road and an uncertain sky. 4 million people were handed a single word, free, and then left with nothing to build the meaning of it entirely on their own. That is not the story of a nation giving freedom. It is the story of a nation that gave the word and kept the world, that said free to 4 million people and left them to make it mean something with their bare hands. It was not enough, and the document that delivered that word made the betrayal plain in its own language. And freedom did not even arrive as a clean, open promise. The document Granger's soldiers carried and read aloud was General Order Number 3, and it rewards reading closely because the betrayal is hidden in its own fine print. It opens exactly as it should. The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with a proclamation from the executive, all slaves are free. That is the declaration, and for a moment it is everything. But the order does not stop there. In nearly the same breath, it turns and adds conditions. The freed people, it says, are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and to work for wages, to stay, in other words, exactly where they were. It declares that the relationship between former master and former slave now becomes one of employer and hired laborer, and it warns coldly that they will not be supported in idleness. read it as a whole and watch the generosity drain out of it. The same single document that ended their bondage tried in its very next lines to bind them right back to the land they had been held on, no longer as property but as low-wage labor in place and at work. Freedom did not arrive as a blank slate full of possibility. It arrived with conditions already stapled to it. June 19th, 1865 was not a finish line. It was a threshold, a door pried open by armies and by fugitives, by an economy in crisis, and by black soldiers reading orders aloud in the streets of a slave port. And through that door walked hundreds of thousands of people all at once into a freedom that no one had defined for them. There was no land waiting on the other side. There was no restitution, no apology, no plan for what was supposed to come next. The same country that had carefully counted these people as property for 200 years had given almost no thought to what they would be as citizens, and it offered them almost nothing. It had spent 2 centuries learning how to hold them, and not one day preparing to release them. Hundreds of thousands of human beings stepped out onto a road no one had built, carrying the entire weight of everything they had survived, with no map in their hands and no promise at all that the single word written on that paper of free would ever match the life they would be allowed to live. Remember the man we started with, bent in the field on the 18th. By the next morning he was standing in a doorway. The man in the field arose to freedom. The order had finally reached him. He was free, and the word arrived with almost nothing attached to it. No land, no restitution, no instruction for how to become a person in a country where the law had only ever recognized him as property. In front of him lay a road no one had built, running out toward a nation that had no place ready for him, and no idea yet what his freedom was even going to mean. He had been counted as wealth his entire life, entered into ledgers, priced, traded, moved across state lines like a commodity on a balance sheet. Now the ledger was closed, and no one had written what came next. The nation that had profited from every hour of his labor had made no accounting for what it owed him. No acre, no dollar, no name on any document that was not a bill of sale. He stood at the edge of a country that had built itself on his back, and now turned away from him as though the debt had been settled by the single word on that page. He had spent the 18th not knowing he was free. He would spend the 19th free and not yet knowing what that freedom would come to. And he stepped through the door anyway, out onto the open morning, carrying the whole weight of what he had survived behind him. The man who had been bent in the field on the 18th walked through the doorway on the 19th, about to find out. Thank you for watching. If you found this information valuable, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue documenting these stories and making these resources accessible to a wider audience. We'll see you in the next video.